Here we are, late winter, spring's in the air, the flowers are beginning to bloom and the grass is growing like crazy because it's been raining. With El Nino coming, most likely there'll be drought within 6 months. But I think what we need to look at today is something which is particularly important. It's the fact that younger Australians, I'm talking about people 40 and under, they're going backwards economically. And the reason is, not as everybody thinks it is, with the growing popularity of the political parties which are keen to divide the nation. The fact is, the situation we find ourselves in today, where since colonisation began we saw every generation life improve, slowly, but it improved. But for the last 30 to 40 years, things are beginning to go backwards for younger people. And this is due to a number of reasons, which have very little to do with migration, refugees and asylum seekers and crime. This is a structural issue which we face in this country because of the adoption of neoliberal policies by successive federal and state governments since the 1980s. Now, what's neoliberalism? It's a fancy word. But neoliberalism is nothing more than an extreme form of capitalism. Historically, people's situation improved when, through action, through strikes, reform movements, revolutionary movements, we saw the state take a greater interest in the welfare of its citizens. Now, historically, the state was nothing more than an apparatus which was used to keep those in power through a monopoly on the use of force. But we saw the state being forced to intervene to prevent revolution. And we saw significant reforms introduced which improved the lives of a significant number of people. Now, this accelerated after World War II, when people who were involved in the war, and let's not forget over 50 million people were killed, murdered during that period, demanded a little bit more, something more. And we saw a rapid increase in state intervention in the capitalist system, and we saw the establishment of institutions like a universal health care and public education, and the list goes on and on. Now, neoliberalism is nothing more than an extreme form of capitalism. Capitalism is about private investment for private profit. The intervention of the state into the relationship between capital and workers meant that profitability decreased for institutions, but living standards improved for working people and people who were not actually able to work. So we saw the state take on a more intrusive and relevant role in people's lives, which improved their options, which then gave them the opportunity to not only benefit economically, but benefit socially and culturally through increased leisure, holiday pay, holidays, and the list goes on and on. Now, neoliberalism is an ideology which is based on the idea that the state should not interfere in economic situations, should not interfere in the economics of a country. Economics should be left to the private sector. not the state. But because reforms had been so all-encompassing, what was required for capital to regain its primary position in society was through the adoption of a new ideology by elected governments, which was based on removing state intervention in the economic equation. I'm talking about Australia and the Western world. So what happened? We had a concept which was called privatisation, which you're all aware of, where we saw public institutions which had been created to provide financial support, provide health support, provide education. We saw many institutions which have been created through the blood, sweat and tears of generations of Australians sold off to the highest bidder. Not because they were not profitable, but because it did not suit the new ideology as the economy was theoretically opened up. Now, privatisation has had a significant impact on younger generations because it means that things we took for granted, now people have to pay. And when you pay for it, what it means is that your options decrease, because not everybody is in a position to put their hands in their pocket or, have a bit of cryptocurrency to pay. So tertiary education was basically privatised in the 1980s by the Labor government, the Hawke-Keating Labor government. So student fees were reintroduced. The major impact of student fees is not on people whose parents have significant disposable income, but it's on those Australians whose parents may be working ordinary jobs, who basically have little disposable income. So what it meant is that since the 1980s, the mid-1980s, students are burdened with a debt before they even start work, and they may take 10, 20, 30, 40 years to pay off that debt, which increases with the rate of inflation. So the Whitlam Labor government in 1972 introduced free tertiary education. The Hawke-Keating Labor government in the mid-1980s abolished free tertiary education. So young people are unless they've got well-off parents with disposable income, are starting behind the starting line. And this has been occurring since the mid-1980s. So this is one reason why things are going backwards. Because instead of concentrating on their education, many people are forced to be involved in short-term, exploitative, part-time jobs. The next reason things have gone backwards is the fact that trade unions have been criminalised in this country. Most of the major reforms which have been created since Federation in 1901 have been due to the activities of trade unions. And withdrawing your labour was a legitimate mechanism via which to improve your situation. But what we've seen is a litany of legislation, act after act after act, which has basically reduced trades unions to nothing more than organisations which collect dues and are limited in the type of strike or type of industrial activity they can perform. They can perform this only during the enterprise bargaining agreement period, which only may occur every 3 to 4 years. So today, less than 12% of working Australians are in trade unions. less than 12%. And the majority are workers who are employed by state governments or federal government. So as far as retail, manufacturing, and the list goes on, union membership is minuscule. So we no longer have a mechanism via which people can bargain by withdrawing their labour through the criminalisation of strike action, secondary boycotts, picket lines, and the list goes on. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for people's wages and conditions to keep up with inflationary pressures. Then we have the opening up of the Australian economy to the world economy. This is called globalisation. What globalisation has done, it has led to the export of significant number of jobs to low-cost country, where there are no trade unions, where wages are ridiculously low. So it becomes increasingly difficult for people to compete. Although we may get cheaper goods, the fact is that the ability to create wealth in this country has been reduced dramatically. We are nothing more than a storehouse economy where products are imported and then they're distributed and then people buy those products. The other problem is that the fact that the economy is controlled in the majority of cases by publicly listed companies. The fact is today in Australia, we are one of the few sovereign nation states in the world, I think there's only two, which you can get a tax deduction for having bought shares. More importantly, with an ageing population and more Australian superannuants investing in stock markets, publicly listed companies, now these publicly listed companies' value is dependent on the amount of money which is invested in those companies through the stock market. So what we are seeing is those companies which pay good dividends at the end of the year, depending on how many shares you own in that company, are the companies that an increasing number of Australians who've got shares invest in. What that means is there is minimal money available to expand industry, manufacturing, retail in this country. The next reason is the digitalisation of the economy. The digitalisation of the economy means that an increasing number of people find themselves in part-time work, or more importantly, in work where there is no security of tenure. The introduction of individual contracts instead of collective bargaining in many areas of the Australian economy means that individuals have difficulty negotiating reasonable pay and conditions because of their very weak bargaining position, because they're not working collectively to improve their situation. Then what we've seen is the privatisation of the housing market. Now, housing has always been fundamental in any society, and the progression was you lived with your parents, you rented, you had a bit of money, you had a deposit, you started buying a home, and by the time you finished work you owned that home fully. But today that equation has gone out of the door, because up till this year, since the 1980s, we have had investment laws which have turned housing from a right to shelter to an investment commodity, And we have seen dramatic increases in shelter in this country because of the fact that the public housing sector has basically been destroyed, left to wither on the vine. And the private housing market has been left in the hands of investors. The minuscule reforms which have occurred regarding negative gearing and capital gains tax have been treated as the end of the known universe in this country over the last few weeks. So we still have this domination of the legacy media by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And another thing which is important is the lack of power parliamentary democracies are able to exercise in a postmodern society. What that means is they can be manipulated by people with wealth. Now, the people who have benefited are not the majority of Australians, not the younger generations. The people who have benefited are the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Their wealth has grown exponentially, while the ability of people to access basic necessities has decreased. So it's no wonder we have 32,000 registered charities in this country providing support for Australians which the government should support. And then we have the ridiculous situation of being one of the richest sovereign nation state on the planet regarding natural resources. And we have allowed governments to give away these natural resources for peppercorn royalties to transnational and national corporations whose major responsibility is to make increasing profits for their major shareholders, irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs. And on top of this, younger people are now beginning to feel the effects of industrialisation, the effects of digitalisation through the climate emergency, and the fact there are significant players in this country and around the world who continue to deny what is obvious to anybody with one synapse neuron in this country. Ultimately, we find ourselves, younger people find themselves in this situation through neoliberal ideology. Not because neoliberal ideology improves people's lives, but because it increases the power and wealth of a minuscule minority. And while we continue to support that system, nothing will change. It doesn't matter how many people you expel from the country. It doesn't matter if there isn't one migrant coming to this country. It doesn't matter. What matters is that wealth and power continues to be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And those who are bearing the major burden are not older Australians who were able to benefit through the intervention of the state in the economy, but younger Australians who are the primary victims of globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation and privatisation, the central, essential elements of an ideology which is not fit for human consumption.